Well, I was, as I mentioned on a number of occasions, I was born in 1979. And so that means that I couldn't see Star Trek the Motion Picture when it was initially released in theaters. But I came to know about it through VHS rentals when I was very young. And the same is true for Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan. Again, I don't recall or I don't remember, and I don't even have any recollection or a vague recollection of a memory of seeing that in the theater per se, but maybe my earliest memory of it, what I can gather right now anyway, is associations with the VHS tape of it. And if you know the back of the VHS cassettes often had stills, usually about two stills plus the bottom half of the box having some kind of write-up or description, brief description. And so I remember one of the stills of Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, the back of the VHS box. I don't know if you remember this too, but one of them was a shot of Khan himself, and half of his face was bloodied and almost maybe burned up due to an explosion on the bridge that occurred, I think, because of an attack on the Reliant by the Enterprise while they were in the Mutara Nebula at the climax of that film. And so if you recall, there's a particular moment where an explosion occurs in the bridge, and I think Khan himself gets caught in that explosion, and we see him his hand reach up over the console as we hear Uhura's voice. You're ordered to surrender your vessel, respond. And then we see Khan, and he has that half face, scarred, bloodied up face look, which is quite graphic actually. And then his non-gloved hand seems to be also very burnt up and damaged as well. And so he can only drag himself using his gloved hand to the Genesis console and initiate the countdown of the torpedo, which is still in the transporter room, of course. And so that's going to mean that the Reliant will explode. And so that means adios to anyone who is in the vicinity, which includes the Enterprise, unless they make a daring escape, which they do, of course, with drastic consequences, of course. But still, it is a very so what was I saying? So yes, so Star Trek II was a film that, of course, is near and dear to my heart, but I don't recall ever seeing in the theater when I was young. Again, since I was born in '79, it would have meant I was still maybe too young to attend films of that nature in the theaters. But it's one that I grew up with so much, and it meant so much to me that it's one of those films where I don't remember not knowing about. And in fact, I think I feel more comfortable with the film Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan in terms of how long I've seen it. I feel like I've known that film more than I know Star Trek: The Motion Picture, because I think it's just a film that I happened to watch a lot when I was a kid growing up. I'm speaking about The Wrath of Khan. So it could be that. And I must admit, too, that the motion picture, Star Trek the Motion Picture, by the way, was one film that I particularly perhaps was not so fond of growing up, but when I was a kid, I mean. But as I was growing up, I became more and more enamored by it until now, when I'm now in my early 40s, and I find the film to be, the motion picture to be a really arresting and quite a captivating sci-fi drama in many senses of that phrase. I think the concept of V'ger is a very fascinating one, and it's one I don't think I fully appreciated when I was younger, but when I'm getting older now, and there's a sense of yearning and trying to figure out one's place, as it were. I'm not sure if I'm the most religious person in the world, but I can certainly feel a certain sense of sympathy, if you will, in terms of V'ger's own journey, and of course that of Spock too in that film, because Spock's journey is made to be somewhat parallel to that of V'ger in terms of yearning and the inability of whatever the Kolinar could have offered him Obviously didn't offer him what he was looking for, which was something else outside of the Kolinar. So there's of course a lot to be said about that journey, and of course there are many moments in that film, the motion picture, that I think hold up incredibly well. There's the theme, the Jerry Goldsmith theme, which is of course classic. It was made even more indelible. I don't want to say that. Maybe I'll take that back. It was, of course, extended in terms of its longevity, which of course it was there to begin with, but it was made even more in terms of this longevity because of its use in the Next Generation. But it started here in the motion picture, and so it was a grand entrance of a really magnificent theme. But you don't need me to tell you that, of course. But there were some great moments in the motion picture. I was, I think, traumatized to bits, so much so by the transporter malfunction scene that even now I'm creeped out by that scene very much. Ugh, even just thinking about it and the screams and it's just it's very frightening. That's one of the scariest scenes in Star Trek, in fact. But and also one of my favorite musical moments. There's the theme that I mentioned, but one of my favorite musical moments is the initial attack of V'ger on the Klingon vessels at the very beginning, and we get the initial approach of the Klingon cruisers towards V'ger, the cloud anyway, and they find that the torpedoes have no effect, at least as far as they can tell, and so they engage evasive maneuvers and try to escape the cloud. And as they're escaping, of course, the V'ger, whatever it is, it takes hold of each of the ships one at a time and just evaporates them until we have the one remaining Klingon ship. And so the Klingon ship, of course, does the thing with the aft torpedoes. And it's not just one, but two, right? There's one extra one that they try to fire into the last minute, but to no avail, of course. But it's during that attack that we hear the great Jerry Goldsmith music that is accompanying this, and it's the dun 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 da 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 da. I think that's such a cool theme. That's one of my favorite music cues in any Star Trek film. And in fact, I don't know. There was that film, the Christopher Nolan film Dunkirk. You remember this film? And the I think it was the trailer. It had a very similar vibe to it. That dun dun dun, and it slowly built up until it just reached a certain climax. And so, and then the Klingon vessel, of course, was no more, at least in the material terms, anyway. The motion picture. I think that's one that took its time for me because I didn't think I was ready for it. I don't think I was quite ready for what it had to offer. But now I realize that it has so much to offer, and I'm really fond of that film. But then, as I say, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan was one that I feel like I knew more, just because of my associations with watching the film on VHS, I think, watching it over and over and over again. The cool factor of it, the music I thought was just one of the best scores I'd ever heard, and the story, of course, was very much. It had the nautical feel. The uniforms looked really cool, and the attack scenes were just out of this world. And Khan was this larger than life villain with these alien things that went into your ear, and the phasers and just all this just really great stuff. Still, I admit I can't quite get over Space Station Regular One and how it's just the inverted version of one of the ship stations that we saw in the motion picture. So I can never get my head wrapped around that myself. I always see Regular One in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and I see that as the right way up. And then whenever I see the motion picture, I always look at that, and I look at the space station there, and I look at that as being upside down. I know the motion picture came first, and so in fact the heavy part of that station is the bottom part. And so Regular One in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan is actually the upside down version. But I always see Regular One as being the right way up, because, as I say, I'm associate most viewings with that film over the motion picture. But I love that too. But one thing I never understood, and even now when I rewatch the film, I never understood. When they go into the cave and Carol Marcus shows Kirk the inside of the Genesis cave, right? And so that was an early stage of the Genesis project, and then a later stage, of course, would the application of Genesis to a barren planet. So that was the whole concept. But first they did their tests in a cave, and so I understand that the cave was inside a particular dead planet, and so I don't. So therefore, the Genesis effect was initiated within this inside cavern. That was my understanding. And so what I never understood, if you look inside the cave, you realize there's all this life and wildlife and greenery, and it's like a jungle or something inside, which is really magnificent, waterfalls and everything. And you look in the distance, and you actually see sunshine appearing from somewhere. And so I always thought, how could the inside of the Genesis cave receive sunshine if it's actually inside a planet, right? Because I don't think the planet itself, or the planet outer crust of the planet, I don't think there was any hole, and I don't recall any star nearby that could serve as a kind of sun-like source of energy like that. So I don't know where that source of light came from that was inside the cave. I mean, unless the inside of the cave had its own light source that served to be analogous to, say, a sun or a nearby star, although that doesn't seem to, even in the world of sci-fi physics like Star Trek, which I understand also relies a little bit on science but also on fiction. So even if we rely on the fiction aspect of that, I can't quite wrap my head around the concept of how the inside of a cave could include sunshine. But I don't know. I'm not a scientist, so maybe it's possible. I just don't have the wherewithal to quite comprehend that. But I understand it. It's a quick shot, and so there's also all these. I mean, it's supposed to be the development of an ecosystem, but it's not in and of itself the development of its own enclosed ecosystem. My understanding is, but the Genesis project is actually to have the planet become somehow inhabitable because of whatever it is, the engendering of certain DNA, or the changing of certain wildlife or something like that to make it habitable. So I understand that. However, we have to remember too that planet structures, at least in terms of my understanding, I understand that planet structures are always developed based on their distance or proximity from an energy source like the solar system and the sun. And so based on the distance, we have the ability of planet, and based on whatever chemicals or organisms or minerals, etc., that are existent in the rock formation that makes up the planetoid, then based on a combination of those factors, right, distance from the sun, the amount of energy therefore that can be received or absorbed by such planetoid, etc., then my understanding is from that sort of chemical reaction, then certain life forms can develop, like maybe plants, surface-based life forms, and then water and things of that nature that an ecosystem can develop. So it's not, but it therefore depends on whether there's an energy source like the sun. So I always thought that the Genesis project was only one half of the equation. You'd also have to find a planet that was a reasonable distance away from an energy source like the sun or a star, that could therefore not just support a sudden burst or suddenly developed ecosystem that would be applied by the Genesis torpedo, but also that could sustain the ecosystem for a certain extended period of time. And so it couldn't just be enough that the Genesis effect would be applied to a barren planet and that would be it. Because what if the barren planet was in a place that had little proximity to any nearby energy source like a sun? Therefore, whatever life that developed on that planet would soon be frozen over into a sort of ice age, if you will, because the ecosystem couldn't be sustained unless there was some kind of nearby energy source like the sun. So anyway, I'm sorry to go on like this, but anyway, I know it's a film too. So but it's the Genesis device, and so that's the big. Maybe it's the MacGuffin. I'm not sure, but it is. The reason why I'm not sure because it is a very central thematic aspect of the film Star Trek II, and by extension Star Trek III, and then Star Trek IV, because of the idea of life after death. And in order to create such life after death, you need to have death, which is, of course, supplied thematically and also narratively by the sudden and very, very dramatic death of Spock. The death of Spock is, of course, probably, for me anyway, the key moment in Star Trek. It is, for me, the key moment. This is I think one of the most iconic moments in sci-fi cinema, and it's played out so emotionally by everyone concerned, but in particular by Spock and by Kirk, of course, William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. And there's one moment in particular where Spock is seen just on the floor crumbled, and Kirk sees what's happened, and he says, he's right. You'll flood the whole port, he'll die. And sir, he's dead already, right? And then he realizes it's too late, and he goes to the glass, and he goes and screams, Spock. And then Spock hears this, and what does he do? He stands up, and the first thing he does after he stands up, he straightens his uniform. You notice that? He's dying. His physical body is, of course, just about to be extinguished forever, but he just stands up and he straightens his uniform. That 1 ounce of dignity that always remains with the beautiful character of Spock. And he goes to the glass. He can't even see. He bumps his nose into the glass, and you can actually see a little bit of the makeup rub off on the glass, and it has that really creepy effect, actually, of how damaged his skin is due to the radiation. And so, and then of course he plays out the scene so poetically, right? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one, which is so brilliantly inverted, is it not, by the next film, Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, right at the very end, and when Spock has returned, right? And so, why did you come back for me? He asks. And then Kirk says, so brilliant, because the needs of the one outweighed the needs of the many. And so this was a brilliant turnaround, I think. And so I really love, actually, the way that Star Trek III developed. That was actually a film that I do remember. I have vague memories as a kid going to the theater and watching that film. I remember, actually, for whatever reason, we were late, and so we walked in to the part at the beginning, actually, when it's actually a replay of that scene in Star Trek II, and it starts like a small screen, and it goes, and it's, I think, sepia or black and white, and it slowly turns into color as those sequences, that montage of Star Trek II plays out. So, and then we go into the theater, and then we watch Star Trek III, which I thought I love that film. I really, really love that film, Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. I thought it was a grand adventure. I thought it was heroic. I thought it had a great sense of the bonds between these people, the crew, especially when they're stealing the Enterprise, and we had the cockiness of the Excelsior, and all that wonderful showdown between the Excelsior and the Enterprise, and oh my goodness, and that great James Horner soundtrack, especially the stealing the Enterprise moment, is one of the best, is it not? Really, really fantastic. I love that soundtrack, by the way, and although with Star Trek III, I always thought it was a little bit. I guess it was a little bit interesting because Star Trek III is supposed to be immediately following the events of Star Trek II, right? And so Star Trek II, we understand, was in essence the new refit of Enterprise. Enterprise was refit, and it was actually refit in the motion picture, and then it was we understand further done up or something for Star Trek 2, or I should say there was a new crew, and Spock was the captain, and so this would be the test voyage, as it were. And so that then they go off, and then Khan confronts them in the Reliant, and all that happens, and then Genesis develops, and then Star Trek 3, and then Spock's body is shot into the Genesis planet, and then Star Trek 3 begins basically where that left off, and so the Enterprise is, after it left space dock and it had its encounter with Khan, now we understand it's supposed to be coming back from that, and we see all the battle damage still and all that, and then from there we understand that the Enterprise would not be getting a refit, and so it wasn't even out of its maiden voyage in Star Trek 2, and it just got basically attacked quite significantly, and it came back, and so the decision, I'm assuming, was made that there would be no refit of this. So it didn't even get to enjoy whatever mission it would have had under Captain Spock and its crew. And then here we have it basically being decommissioned. So I'm talking about the ship anyway. And so this actually sets the stage very nicely for what happens over the course of the film, Star Trek 3, as you know, with the destruction of the Enterprise and that wonderful sequence. And so what a great moment that's. I mean, there are so many iconic moments combined with the beautiful score. Stealing the Enterprise is one. The self-destruct and the destruction of the Enterprise as the crew looks on from the surface of the Genesis planet in order to, right, according to McCoy, right, this is what you do, what you've always done, what you always do, turn death into a fighting chance to live, right? And then they do the final confrontation with the Klingons and the Christopher Lloyd character after, of course, much loss has been incurred by Kirk and David and his very tragic yet heroic final sacrifice in order to save young Spock and Saavik. And that was such a poignant moment too, when Kirk realizes that David is dead, and he falls back, and he doesn't even sit in his chair, he just falls onto the ground. And of course that lays the seeds so poetically into Star Trek 6 very nicely. And so but here we have it right here. It's laid bare, and my goodness, what a shocking moment that is. Really, really shocking. But of course we had the return of Spock, and one of my favorite moments too is when they free McCoy, who is basically in custody, and what is it? Kirk says, how many fingers am I holding up? And so I thought that was a really great moment. I always laugh every time. And so, and then Sulu has his moment, which I never understood. He basically says, keeping you busy, and then he says, don't get smart, Tiny. I never understood why he had to be so mean like that. He was just trying to be friendly, Sulu, that is. So I never saw Sulu to be anything but just trying to break the ice and just enjoy. So the guard, I thought, was really out of line. And so what did Sulu say? Don't call me Tiny. So there are a lot of character moments in Star Trek 3, which I thought was just. I really love that, and it came later when Star Trek 6 was released in theaters, and I remember Siskel and Ebert gave Star Trek 6 a really positive review. They referred to, during their review of Star Trek, they referred to this thing about the odd-numbered Trek films and the even-numbered Trek films, at least up to 6. And they said, 1, 3, 5 were bad, 2, 4, 6 were good. And so I always, when I heard that, I was actually shocked when I heard that, because I always thought in my heart that Star Trek 3 was one of the best. And I loved that so much. And so when I heard this odd-numbered, even-numbered thing, I was actually very shocked. So, and I will defend Star Trek 3 very much. And in fact, Star Trek 3 has been in my mind lately, because as you know, now it's 2020, and now it's October 2020. It's been quite a rough, stressful year with all this pandemic, worldwide health crisis, and all this stuff. what a terrible year it's been in that regard. Hopefully there will be a positive and outcome to this, and a resolution where everyone will be safe and health concerns will not be preoccupied with this pandemic crisis. So in that sense, I always think of the fight between I guess it's Admiral Kirk still, Kirk and Christopher Lloyd Cruz, the Klingon captain. And I always think of that fight they have on the Genesis planet that is just exploding all around them. And what is it? Give me Genesis, right? And so what does he say? And Kirk has such a great ear for languages, I suppose. He just hears it once and he can mimic it immediately. What does he say? He says, John Larroquette, Cho, and I'm sorry, not John. He says, Maltz, Choi Chu, which is supposed to mean malts, beam them up, I guess. And then upon hearing that once, Kirk can then mimic it later when he needs to beam up off of the surface of Genesis in order to trick John Larroquette's malts and make sure they're getting on to the bird of prey, which they do on time, which is wonderful. But what was I saying? So the fight, of course, the final fight between Cruz and Kirk on the unstable surface of the Genesis planet. It's all being destroyed all around them, and it's a wonderful metaphor. Of course, life. Death begets life, begets death, begets life. So it's a wonderful metaphor. Things have been dying in Star Trek 3, the death of the Enterprise, the death of David, and the death of the Genesis planet, but all for the sake of the birth of Spock, the young Spock, the new Spock. But as this is playing out, of course, we had the final mano-a-mano confrontation between these two titans. Wow, what a fight this is. Cruz in particular has a very almost samurai-like way about him. He seems to be so intent on beating his opponent to the point where if he sees acts of self-destruction to be to his advantage, he will apply them, which he does so almost so to the point of being almost unreasonable. Which is a frightening aspect if you're thinking about fighting an enemy. But Kirk holds his own very well. Of course, he had the benefit, I suppose, of being on the higher ground, so to speak, to borrow a phrase from Obi-Wan Kenobi in a different film franchise. But he had the high ground when he needed it the most, and the cliff at the very end, which is a very iconic moment, another iconic moment. And I remember, of course, one of my favorite moments is when Cruz is on the cliff edge there and he's climbing, and then Kirk being just that last moment of being human. He says, give me your hand. But what does Cruz do? He doesn't take his hand, he just grabs his foot. And he's just trying to pull him over the edge, basically. If I go, you go, that kind of mentality. And then what does Kirk do? I love what Kirk does here as a cinematic moment. He's just like, he just shakes his head. Oh, I've had enough. And that's what he says. And he kicks him, and he kicks him off, and then he falls into the lava pit. But he doesn't just kick him off, of course. He does it in that wonderful stilted language, William Shatner way. I have had enough of you. I love how what the enough of, that part enough of, I love there is a rhythm to it. I have had enough of you. And then boom, he falls, Christopher Lloyd's Cruz falls into the lava pit, and we see, or Christopher Lloyd's, I guess, animated body, I suppose, after a flash, it falls into the lava pit, and just boom, you see that. And then we see a shot of Kirk looking over his bloodied face, which is actually one of the stills, if I recall, that was used on the back of the VHS of Star Trek 3, The Search of Spock, right? Which I always got a kick out of. But whenever I saw the VHS back pictures, I'd always watch the film, and I'd always try to catch where in the film those pictures would appear. So that was one of them. One of the pictures anyway on the back of the Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock VHS box, if I remember correctly. But the reason why I bring this up, and the reason why it's been in my memory, is because Kirk kicks off Cruz right at the end, and he falls to his death, and he has that wonderful "I have had enough of you," right? we have all this stuff with the pandemic, right, and this terrible thing that's going on, the virus, right, that's going on. If this current, COVID, if COVID were personified into some kind of person, and if I were, say, in a hand-to-hand combat, mano a mano, with this COVID personified, let's say this person and I were fighting, much like Kirk and Cruge were fighting on the unstable planet surface of a destructive Genesis planet, and we were fighting, and we're going at it to the death. We fall to the cliff, and then this virus personified is on the cliff edge. All this stuff that's been happening in 2020, everything that's been going on. One of the things I'd love to say in order just to get rid of this, to borrow the words from Captain Kirk or Admiral Kirk, right? Again, if this whole pandemic virus were personified and I were in a fisticuffs with it to the death, and I'd just love to say to it, I have had enough of you, boom, and then I just love it to just go away like that. So of course, life unfortunately cannot always imitate art the way we would like it, but if I had that option, if I could have it so that life could somehow imitate art, then perhaps that imitation could involve the personification of this current pandemic crisis, such that it could end in a similar way that Kirk and Cruge's fight ends, with that great coup de grace of dialogue. I have had enough of you, right? So, but anyway, oh well, c'est la vie, that's, I suppose. But going back to Star Trek 3, yeah, that's a great film. That is a really great film indeed. I always also have I was going to say, what was I going to say? I was going to say something, but I completely forgot what I was going to say. So, yeah,